What hidden strength allowed a medieval village to not just survive winter's icy grip, but to find a secret, resilient light in its deepest and most profound darkness? What ancient wisdom, passed down through countless generations, gave them the tools not only to endure the biting cold and the endless nights, but to find a quiet rhythm of life within them? Imagine the air around you growing crisp, carrying the first real hint of a chill that will soon settle deep into the bones of the earth. The last golden light of autumn bathes the fields in a soft, forgiving glow, making the world seem painted in shades of honey and amber. It is here, on the very edge of the season, caught between the memory of warmth and the promise of cold, that our story begins. It's always so wonderful to think about who is settling in to listen with us. I'm always curious, where in the world are you, and what time is it for you now? In this moment, it feels like we're all gathered around a great, big, global hearth, sharing a story together. Now, find your coziest spot, settle in, and let's get comfortable. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we journey back to a time governed entirely by the seasons. We will be stepping into the well-worn leather shoes of a medieval peasant as they and their entire community face their greatest annual challenge, the coming of the winter. The story begins in the fields, under a sky that is a paler blue than it was just a few weeks ago. An urgent energy hums through the air, a silent understanding shared by every man, woman, and child. This is a race against the frost. From the moment the sun's first weak rays spill over the horizon until the last light fades, the entire community is a single, moving organism, driven by one purpose: to bring in the last of the harvest. The primary crops here are not the delicate wheat that the Lord might demand for his own fine bread, but the hardier, more forgiving grains of rye and barley. These are the true staff of life for the village, the grains that will be milled into a coarse flour to make the dark, dense, and deeply nourishing bread that will sustain them through the cold months. It is a bread with a heavy, moist crumb and a thick crust, and the thought of it, warm and filling, is a powerful motivator. The work is back-breaking. Most of the peasants are bent low to the ground, using a tool that has barely changed in 1,000 years. The sickle, unlike the long, sweeping scythe, which is faster but more wasteful, the sickle requires a more intimate, careful approach. Each worker grabs a handful of stalks, pulls them taut, and with a swift upward curve of the arm, slices through them with a satisfying swish cut. The motion is repeated endlessly, a rhythmic dance of human effort against the vastness of the field. It is slow, painstaking work, but it ensures that very few of the precious grains are shaken loose from the ear and lost to the soil. Every single grain saved is a victory, a tiny down payment on a future meal. The day's labor is governed by a strict and unchangeable hierarchy. Before any peasant can turn their attention to the small strip of land they cultivate for their own family, they must first work on the Lord's fields, the vast expanse known as the domain. This creates a quiet tension that hangs in the air along with the dust and the scent of cut grain. They watch the sky constantly, their eyes scanning the clouds for any sign of change. They are amateur meteorologists, their knowledge born of necessity. They can distinguish dozens of types of clouds and read the subtle shifts in the wind. A sky that looks like a fish's scales, what they call a mackerel sky, might mean rain is coming. High, wispy clouds that look like a horse's tail could signal an approaching storm. This is not idle sky-gazing. It is a vital, practical science used to predict the weather and time their work, praying the heavens will grant them enough time to harvest their own meager crops after the Lord's have been secured. As the main harvest is brought in, another, quieter harvest begins in its wake. Following the reapers are the gleaners. These are the poorest members of the community, the elderly, whose backs can no longer take the strain of reaping, the widows with no husband to work their land, and young children too small for heavier tasks. Sanctioned by the church, the practice of gleaning allows them to walk the harvested fields and collect any leftover ears of grain that were missed. They move slowly, their eyes trained on the ground, their fingers patiently plucking single stalks from the stubble. It is a slow and arduous way to gather food, but it is a crucial part of the village's social safety net. It ensures that no one is left entirely behind, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, of God's bounty is wasted. The work is relentless, but it is not silent. To keep the pace and lift their spirits, the villagers often sing. The songs are simple, rhythmic chants, their melodies rising and falling with the swing of the sickles. A man with a strong voice might call out a line, and the others will answer in chorus. This shared sound, this human noise, layered over the rustle of stalks and the whisper of the wind, transforms the field of labor into a kind of outdoor cathedral of shared purpose. It binds them together, turning individual toil into a collective, communal effort. But the harvest is not only about grain. Elsewhere in the village's common fields, others are digging into the rich, dark soil. They are pulling up the vital root vegetables that will be a cornerstone of the winter diet. The satisfying thud of a spade turning the earth is followed by the sight of a pale turnip or a long, creamy parsnip being lifted from the ground. These vegetables, unlike leafy greens, are masters of preservation. Stored carefully in a cool, dark root cellar, they will keep for months, providing sustenance and a welcome change of texture in the monotonous winter diet of bread and salted meat. Even the children have their roles in this great communal push. The youngest ones, barely old enough to walk steadily, are tasked with scaring birds away from the cut grain. They run through the stubble, shouting and waving their arms, or shaking wooden clappers that make a startling racket. Older children act as water carriers, hauling heavy wooden buckets from the village well to the thirsty workers in the fields. It is a lesson taught from the earliest age. Everyone contributes, everyone has value, and the survival of all depends on the work of each. As the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows across the now bare fields, a special moment arrives. The very last sheaf of grain is to be cut. This is not just another bundle of stalks. It holds a deep, ritualistic importance. It is cut with a certain reverence, and from its golden straws, the women will weave an intricate figure known as a corn dolly. This little woven doll, often shaped like a woman, is believed to house the spirit of the grain, the very essence of the harvest's life force. It will be taken back to the village and hung in a place of honor, perhaps in the rafters of the manorial hall, where it will be kept safe and dry throughout the winter. It is a symbol of hope, a tangible promise that the spirit of the harvest will sleep through the cold and be ready to be planted again in the spring, ensuring the cycle of life continues. Finally, the distant ringing of the parish church bell echoes across the valley, a sound that signals the official end of the working day. A collective sigh of relief seems to ripple through the fields, but the work is not truly over. As the exhausted peasants trudge back to their cottages, they carry their tools with them. By the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle, or the glow of the central hearth, they will meticulously clean the dirt from the wooden handles and metal blades. The rhythmic scrape of a whetstone sharpening a sickle's edge is the final sound of the day's labor. The tools must be ready for tomorrow, because the race against the frost will begin again with the rising of the sun. As the last cart, groaning under the weight of the golden grain, is triumphantly pulled from the fields, the focus of the village naturally shifts. The act of reaping is done. Now begins the next crucial step, processing the bounty they have all worked so hard to secure. The journey of the grain continues, moving from the open, wind-swept fields to the vast, dusty interior of the manorial barn. This cavernous structure, with its high-beamed ceiling and large doors at either end, is now the center of village life. Here, the next stage of the process begins: threshing. The air inside is thick with a golden haze as sunbeams slant through the open doorways, illuminating a storm of swirling dust and chaff. The goal is to separate the edible grains from the inedible stalks and husks, a task accomplished with a simple yet formidable tool: the flail. The flail consists of 2 pieces of wood, a longer handstaff to hold, and a shorter, heavier swingle that does the striking, connected by a simple leather hinge. Wielding it effectively requires a specific skill and rhythm, a circular motion that brings the swingle down flat onto the sheaves of grain spread across the floor. The sound inside the barn is a deafening, percussive symphony. It is the constant, rhythmic asterisk thump, 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 asterisk of a dozen or more wooden flails striking the floor in a staggered, hypnotic beat. The floor itself is a specially prepared surface, not just dirt, but earth that has been packed, hardened, and sometimes mixed with clay, or even animal blood, to make it smooth and durable enough to withstand the relentless pounding. The physical exertion is immense. It is a full-body workout that engages the muscles of the back, shoulders, and arms. Sweat drips from the workers' brows, carving clean lines through the coating of dust and chaff that clings to their skin. It is exhausting, repetitive, and incredibly vital work. The air is dry and dusty, and it tastes of earth and straw. This fine dust, the chaff, seems to get into everything, coating hair, filling lungs, and making eyes itch. But, like everything else in this world, it is not considered waste. This light, fluffy material will be carefully swept up and used as a clean, absorbent bedding for the animals in their winter shelters. It will provide a bit of warmth and comfort for the precious cow or the handful of pigs that are essential to a family's survival. Nothing is discarded when the margin between survival and starvation is so thin. After hours of relentless beating, the rhythmic thumping subsides. The grain has been knocked loose from the stalks. Now, a new process begins: winnowing. The large barn doors are thrown wide open to create a crossbreeze. The mixture of grain and chaff is scooped up into wide, shallow baskets or onto flat wooden shovels. Then, with a gentle, practiced flick of the wrists, the mixture is tossed into the air. It is a moment of simple, practical magic. The heavy, precious grains fall almost straight back down onto a waiting canvas sheet, while the light, worthless chaff is caught by the breeze and blown away, creating a glittering golden cloud that drifts out of the barn door. This process is repeated over and over until a clean, heavy pile of pure grain begins to form on the floor. It is a deeply satisfying sight, the tangible result of all their labor. Unlike the often solitary work of reaping in the vast fields, the barn is a more social space. The close quarters and the shared rhythm of the work encourage conversation. Here, after the focused isolation of the fields, is the time for gossip, for jokes, for the sharing of news that has traveled from a nearby village. Young men might try to show off their strength and stamina with the flail, while women exchange news about their families as they work together, winnowing the grain. It is a loud, energetic, and deeply communal atmosphere, a welcome change from the silent concentration of the harvest itself. However, a figure of authority is always present, observing the work. This is the manorial reeve. He is a peasant himself, often elected by the villagers or appointed by the Lord for his reliability and good sense. He stands by with a measuring scoop and a tally stick, his expression serious. His job is to measure and record the total yield. This is a moment of quiet anxiety for every family, because the size of that golden pile of grain determines their future. From this total, a tithe of 10% must be set aside for the church. After that, the Lord's rent must be paid, which is often not in coin, but in kind, with a significant portion of the very grain they have just harvested. The reeve carefully measures out these shares, his actions a stark reminder of the obligations that define their lives. What is left over is what the family has to survive on for the entire winter. The leftover straw from the threshing process is another treasure. It is a vital resource with a multitude of uses. The best, longest stalks will be set aside for rethatching roofs, a necessary repair before the winter rains and snows arrive. The rest will be used as fodder to supplement the diet of the livestock, or as bedding for both animals and people. Piles of the clean golden straw represent warmth, shelter, and comfort, a secondary bounty from the harvest. The work in the barn can continue even if the weather turns. An autumn rain might begin to fall, drumming steadily on the thick thatched roof, but inside, protected from the elements, the essential work of threshing and winnowing carries on. It is a small but significant mercy. With the grain now separated, cleaned, and measured, the immediate, pressing question becomes one of preservation. This precious food, the currency of their survival, must be carefully stored to last through the long, dark months to come. Our journey follows the grain, now scooped into rough, burlap sacks, as it leaves the bustling barn for the quiet larders of the village. The focus of the village now turns inward, from the communal spaces of the field and barn to the individual family hearths and pantries. The challenge is no longer about gathering, but about preserving. The grain is relatively simple to store, kept in sacks or wooden bins in a dry place. But the rest of the autumn bounty requires incredible ingenuity and constant labor to make it last through the winter. A crucial date in the peasant calendar is Martinmas, around the 11th of November. This day marks the traditional time for the autumn slaughter. With not enough fodder to keep all the livestock fed through the winter, older animals, particularly pigs and cattle, are cold. It is a somber, bloody, but absolutely necessary affair. The squeal of a pig is a sound that signals both an end and a beginning. The loss of a living animal, but the gain of precious meat that will sustain the family. The primary method for preserving this meat is salting. Salt is an expensive and carefully controlled commodity, sometimes called white gold, but it is essential. Large cuts of pork and beef are rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt, which draws out the moisture and prevents the growth of bacteria that cause rot. The salted meat is then packed tightly into large wooden barrels filled with a strong brine solution. The sharp, briny smell of a salting barrel is the signature scent of late autumn in the village, a smell that promises future meals and security against hunger. Another key method is smoking. In a dedicated smokehouse, or simply hanging from the blackened rafters of a peasant's own smoky cottage, sides of bacon and whole hams are hung to slowly dry. A low, smoldering fire of aromatic woods like oak or apple wood is kept burning for days, and its fragrant smoke slowly cures the meat, imparting a deep, rich flavor while also acting as a preservative. The sight of these dark, glistening cuts of meat hanging from the ceiling is like a promise of savory, fatty richness in the lean months ahead. Preservation extends to all manner of foodstuffs. Vegetables like peas and beans are left to dry on the vine or are shelled and laid out on cloths near the fire until they are hard as little stones. Fruits, especially apples, are handled with great care. The best, unblemished ones are laid out on beds of straw in a cool, dark room, where they might keep for several months. The rest are put into a large wooden press. The whole family might take turns pushing the heavy beam of the cider press, the sweet, fermenting scent of crushed apples filling the air as the juice runs out. This cider is a vital source of drink and calories through the winter. Pickling is another essential craft. Using vinegar or a sour brine made from the juice of crab apples, called verjuice, villagers preserve vegetables like cabbages, shredded and packed into large clay crocks. The cabbage ferments, transforming into a food similar to sauerkraut. Its sharp taste a welcome contrast to the blandness of the winter diet, and its vitamins a crucial defense against sickness. The goodness of summer milk is also captured and stored. Women spend hours working the butter churn, the rhythmic splashing sound, a constant in the cottage. The fresh butter is heavily salted to make it last. The remaining milk is turned into hard, long-lasting cheeses. The curds pressed into molds and left to age in a cool place. A wheel of hard cheese is a storehouse of protein and fat, a compact and durable form of wealth. The forests and hedgerows provide their own bounty. Everyone, including children, spends time foraging for nuts like hazelnuts and walnuts, gathered and stored in sacks. These are a vital source of fat and protein, ready to be added to winter stews or eaten by the handful for a boost of energy. The primary sweetener, honey, is collected from beehives or skeps with great care. It is a precious commodity, used not only to sweeten food, but also for its medicinal and preservative properties. A sealed pot of thick golden honey is one of a family's most valuable assets. For villages near rivers or the coast, fish are a huge part of the preservation effort. Herring and cod are caught in vast numbers. They are gutted, cleaned, and then either packed in barrels with enormous quantities of salt or hung on large wooden racks to be air-dried by the wind. This process turns them into stockfish, which become as hard and durable as a piece of wood. They must be soaked and beaten before they can be eaten, but they provide a critical source of protein, especially on the many days when the church forbids the eating of meat. All of these preserved treasures are stored in the larder or pantry. This is usually a small, cool, dark room or a large cupboard, often the most secure part of the cottage. To look inside is to see the sum of a family's hopes for the winter. The smoked hams hanging from hooks, the sacks of dried peas, the wheels of cheese on a shelf, the clay pots of pickled cabbage, and the barrels of salted fish. The The larder is a fortress against hunger, and its contents represent the anxious but resolute determination of the family to survive. The food is now stored. The larders are as full as they are going to be. Now, the final preparations turn from the food to the very structures that will provide shelter from the coming cold. The frantic energy of the harvest gives way to a more methodical and determined flurry of activity. The final task is to prepare the physical village for the harshness of winter, a process known as battening down the hatches. The focus is on the cottages themselves, humble structures that must become warm, dry sanctuaries against the elements. Most peasant homes are made of a simple wooden frame with walls of wattle and daub. The wattle is a woven lattice of thin wooden branches, and the daub is a sticky plaster made from a mixture of clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. This daub cracks and erodes over time, and before winter it must be repaired. The pungent, earthy smell of fresh daub fills the air as families work together, smearing the thick mixture into the cracks and gaps in their walls with their bare hands. The roofs, typically thatched with thick layers of straw, also demand attention. Thatch provides excellent insulation, but it needs to be in good repair to prevent leaks from winter rain and snow. A skilled thatcher might be seen on a roof against the gray autumn sky, skillfully weaving in new bundles of straw to patch any weak spots, ensuring the home beneath will stay dry. Firewood is perhaps the most critical resource of all. In the crisp air, the sharp, echoing crack of an axe splitting logs is a constant sound. Peasants have a rite known as Eastover, which allows them to gather a certain amount of wood from the Lord's forests. But this rite is strictly limited. They can only take fallen branches and dead wood, never cut down a living tree. The whole family is involved in gathering this fuel, dragging the wood back to their cottage and stacking it into a neat, tall pile. The size of a family's woodpile is a clear indicator of how warm they will be during the winter. The windows in these cottages are not glazed with glass, but are simply small openings in the wall to let in a little light and air. In winter, these are a major source of drafts. To seal them, wooden shutters are closed and barred. For a little translucent light, a piece of oiled cloth or paper might be stretched across the opening. It does little to keep out the cold, but it blocks the worst of the wind. A final, ingenious method of defense against the cold involves bringing the animals inside. A family's most precious livestock, perhaps a milk cow or a few chickens, are often brought into the cottage itself at night. They are kept in a separate section, sometimes divided by only a simple wicker screen, at one end of the single-room dwelling. This protects the animals from the freezing weather and predators, and their shared body heat provides a surprising amount of extra warmth for the human inhabitants. Around the village, there are other signs of preparation. Paths are cleared of any remaining debris, and any tools or equipment that could be damaged by frost or buried in snow are brought into sheds or barns. Every tool is cleaned, perhaps given a light coat of grease to prevent rust, and stored away until spring. As the winds grow stronger, a heavy stone or a log might be placed against the base of a cottage door to prevent it from being blown open by a sudden winter gale. Every tiny crack and gap in the walls is a potential entry point for the biting cold. Children and the elderly are often tasked with gathering moss and dried leaves, which they carefully stuff into these small openings, providing an extra layer of natural insulation. Thought is also given to the water supply. The village well must be covered to prevent a thick, impassable layer of ice from forming on its surface. Those who rely on a nearby stream know that its edges will soon begin to freeze over, and they make plans for how they will break through the ice to get the water they need for drinking, cooking, and washing. This is also the last chance to trade for any essential goods before winter makes travel difficult or even impossible. The visit of a traveling merchant or a final trip to a nearby market town is an opportunity to acquire things the village cannot produce itself: more salt, a new iron pot, or a fine steel needle. With these last errands run, the preparations are finally complete. The fields are bare, the food is stored, the animals are sheltered, and the homes are sealed as tightly as they can be. The frantic energy of autumn gives way to a profound and watchful quiet. And then, one afternoon, the air grows still, and the gray sky seems to hang low over the village. The first snowflake begins to fall, then another and another. It is a moment of quiet beauty, but also a final signal. The world outside is shutting down. The village settles in for the long wait, and our story shifts from the world of communal labor outside to the smaller, more intimate world within. It's truly amazing to see how a whole community moved as one to prepare for the winter. What's a simple ritual you have for preparing your own home for a change in seasons? It's a wonderful thought that these small acts of preparation connect us all through time. As the world outside falls silent under a blanket of snow, the frantic, communal energy of the harvest fades into a distant memory. Life now contracts, pulling away from the frozen fields and drawing inward into the small, smoky confines of the peasant cottage. The pace of life slows deliberately, governed not by the sun, but by the gentle, hypnotic rhythm of the fire. Here, in the hearth's warm embrace, we discover the intimate, domestic world that was the secret heart of winter survival. This is a story of warmth and craft, of quiet endurance, and of the surprising light that can be found in the deepest darkness. We step through a low wooden door, leaving the biting wind behind us, and enter a space that is at once sheltering and strange to our modern senses. The air is thick with wood smoke, catching in the throat and lending a hazy, dreamlike quality to the scene. There is no chimney here. In the center of the single, earth-floored room, a fire is built upon a simple stone hearth. The smoke rises, mingling with the savory steam from a cooking pot, and mushrooms out across the low ceiling. It drifts lazily in the rafters, seeking escape through a dedicated hole in the roof or through the countless small gaps in the thatched ceiling. This constant veil of smoke is the defining feature of the indoor world. It stings the eyes, it blackens the walls, and it infuses everything with its pungent, earthy scent. Yet, this ever-present smoke has an unintended and beneficial side effect. Over the years, the thick, greasy soot, this process, much like the smoking of a ham, preserves the structure of the house itself. It makes the wood and straw unpalatable to insects and resistant to the rot that dampness can bring. The cottage, in a way, is constantly curing itself, its smoky atmosphere a shield against decay. The fire is the living heart of this small world, and its needs dictate the rhythm of the day and night. Fuel is far too precious to be wasted. Every piece of firewood, gathered with such effort in the autumn, is carefully rationed. To supplement the wood, other fuels are burned. Dried animal dung, collected from the pastures in summer, burns with a surprising, intense heat. In regions near marshlands, peasants would cut and dry bricks of peat, which would smolder for hours, releasing a unique aromatic smoke. As night falls, a crucial ritual takes place. This is the origin of our modern word curfew, which comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, meaning to cover the fire. Instead of letting the fire burn out, the woman of the house will carefully bank the embers, covering them with a thick layer of ash. This deprives the coals of oxygen, causing them to smolder with a gentle, latent heat rather than burning away. It is an act of profound foresight, a way of tucking the fire into bed for the night. In the morning, the ash can be gently scraped away to reveal the still glowing embers ready to be revived with a breath of air and a few dry twigs, saving the immense difficulty and frustration of starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel. After the sun sets, the fire becomes the only source of light. The family's entire world shrinks to the small, flickering circle of warmth and orange glow cast by the hearth. Beyond this pool of light, the corners of the room are lost in deep, impenetrable shadows. All activities are drawn towards this central point. The best sleeping spots, closest to the radiating heat, are reserved for the very young or the very old. Here they lie on simple palliasses, cloth sacks stuffed with straw or dried leaves, which rustle gently with every movement. Further from the fire, the chill of the winter air can still be felt, a constant reminder of the world held at bay just beyond the daub walls. A large iron cauldron, its surface blackened by years of use, is almost permanently suspended over the fire from a hook. This pot contains the perpetual stew, or pottage, that is the cornerstone of the winter diet. It is a thrifty, ever-changing meal. Each day, new ingredients are added to whatever remains from the day before. A handful of dried peas, a roughly chopped turnip, some wild herbs, and perhaps, for flavor, a tiny piece of precious salted bacon. The rich, savory smell of the pottage is the constant aroma of home, a comforting scent that fills the small space day and night. The fire is not just for warmth, cooking, and light. It is also an essential tool. A man might carefully hold the tip of a new wooden tool he is crafting in the embers, the intense heat hardening the wood, making it far more durable for the work of the coming spring. The fire provides the focused light needed for all the indoor work that fills the long winter hours. But this life-giving force is also a constant danger. A stray spark could easily ignite the dry straw on the floor or the thatched roof above, turning the cozy sanctuary into a deadly inferno in minutes. Because of this, a bucket of water or sand is always kept within arm's reach of the hearth, a silent sentinel against the ever-present threat of fire. On the very coldest nights, a family might choose to conserve their own precious fuel. They will perform the curfew ritual early and then make their way through the snow to a neighbor's cottage. There, two families, or even three, will crowd together, sharing the warmth of a single fire, their combined body heat making the small space even cozier. It is in these moments, huddled together in the smoky dimness, that the bonds of community are forged, strengthened by the shared experience of enduring the winter together. As the family gathers in the small pool of light cast by the fire, their hands are never idle. The flickering glow illuminates the essential work that filled the long winter hours, the patient crafts that turned raw materials into the very fabric of their lives. With the demanding work of the farm dormant under the snow, winter was the season for making and mending. For the women of the household, the task of spinning was nearly constant. In her hands, a woman would hold a distaff, a short staff, on which a bundle of raw, cleaned wool or flax was wound. With her other hand, she would expertly draw out a few fibers, twisting them together as she let a simple weighted stick, the drop spindle, fall towards the floor. As it dropped, it spun rapidly, twisting the loose fibers into a strong, continuous thread. It was a kind of magic, performed over and over, a rhythmic and almost meditative task that could be done while watching the pottage, while telling a story, or even while walking. This thread was the first step towards creating cloth. Weaving was a much larger and more stationary task. A simple, vertical loom, often built by the man of the house, might be set up inside the cottage, taking up a significant amount of the limited space. The work was slow and painstaking. The weaver would pass a shuttle, holding a spool of thread back and forth between the taut vertical threads of the warp, beating each new line of thread firmly into place with a wooden bar. The clack and thump of the loom was a common winter sound, a steady rhythm of creation. The result was a rough, sturdy cloth, honest and durable, ready to be made into the simple tunics and leggings that everyone wore. Clothing was so labor-intensive to produce that nothing was ever thrown away. Mending was not just a chore, it was an art form. By the light of the fire, a woman would sew a patch over a worn elbow or carefully darn a hole in a stocking. Garments were mended until they became a patchwork of repairs, each patch telling a story of long use. When an item of clothing was finally beyond repair, it was given a new life. It would be cut down to make clothes for a child, or torn into strips to be used as rags, or even shredded to become stuffing for a mattress. Every last scrap was valued. While the women were spinning and weaving, the men would turn their hands to woodworking, a skill often called whittling. Sitting close to the fire for light, a man would take a piece of seasoned wood and a sharp knife. The sharp, pleasant smell of fresh wood shavings would fill the air as he patiently carved a new handle for a plow or an axe, a set of simple wooden bowls, or a collection of smooth, practical spoons. This was not merely a hobby. It was the essential work of creating and maintaining the tools the family needed to survive. He might also turn his hand to leather. The pungent smell of tanned hide would signal the mending of a harness for the ox, a belt, or the simple leather shoes that were a luxury for many. Pushing a sharp awl and a thick needle through the tough leather required strength and patience. But this work ensured that the equipment would be ready for the moment the spring thaw finally came. Other essential items were also crafted during these quiet months. Strong ropes, vital for farming and daily life, were made by twisting together fibers from plants like hemp or even stinging nettles. Using reeds or flexible willow branches gathered from the riverbank, skilled hands would practice the ancient craft of basket weaving. The quiet, methodical work produced strong, light containers essential for carrying everything from eggs to firewood. In the autumn, various plants would have been gathered to make natural dyes. Now, in the winter, the hanks of newly spun yarn would be soaked in dye pots, kept warm by the hearth. Onion skins produced a lovely yellow walnut husks, a deep brown, and the root of the madder plant a prized, if muted, red. This was the chance to bring a little color into a mostly gray and brown world. True candles made of beeswax were an unimaginable luxury, reserved for the church or the Lord's manor. For a little extra light for close work, a family might make rushlights. These were created by gathering rushes from the wetlands, peeling away the outer layer to reveal the pith inside, and then dipping the pith repeatedly into hot, leftover animal fat. The resulting rushlight, when lit, gave a dim, sputtering, and smoky light that lasted for only a short time. but it was a welcome supplement to the glow of the hearth. These tasks were often done communally. A group of neighbors might gather in one cottage to work together, the women spinning, the men carving. The quiet, focused work was accompanied by the hum of conversation, the sharing of skills, and the telling of stories. It transformed solitary labor into a warm, social activity, weaving the fabric of the community as surely as their looms wove cloth. This quiet, focused work, however, was often accompanied by another essential winter activity, one that required no light and no tools, only memory and a voice. This leads us to the timeless tradition of storytelling. In a world where most people were illiterate, the long, dark winter nights were the perfect time for the sharing of stories. This was not just idle entertainment. It was the primary way that history, faith, knowledge, and culture were preserved and passed down from one generation to the next. The collective memory of the village was their library, and the storyteller was their most important book. Huddled in the firelight, with the wind howling outside, the world of the imagination could come alive. Many of the most popular stories were the lives of the saints. These were the heroic tales of their time, filled with miracles, adventure, and clear moral lessons. Children would listen with wide eyes to the story of St. George, the brave knight who slew a terrible dragon to save a princess, a powerful tale of good triumphing over evil. They would hear of St. Francis, who could talk to the animals, a story that taught kindness and respect for all of God's creation. These stories reinforced the teachings of the parish priest and provided a powerful moral framework for their lives. Alongside these holy tales were the older, wilder stories, the local folk tales that seemed to rise from the land itself. These were stories of the hidden world that existed just beyond the village fields, a world of fairies, goblins, and mischievous sprites. These tales often served as warnings. A story about a man led astray into a bog by a flickering fairy light was a cautionary tale against walking alone at night. A tale of a goblin who soured the milk of a lazy housewife was a reminder to keep a clean and orderly home. Entertainment also came in the form of riddles and proverbs, which served as a form of education and mental exercise. An elder might pose a riddle to the children, sharpening their wits and teaching them to think in new ways. I have a mouth, but never speak. I have a bed, but never sleep. What am I? The answer, a river, would teach a child to see the world in a more poetic and metaphorical way. Proverbs provided simple, memorable nuggets of wisdom about farming and life. A dry March and a wet May fill the barn with corn and hay. In a world without a written press, news and gossip were a vital form of information, shared and embellished around the fire. A rare traveler who had passed through the village weeks before would have their stories retold until they became legend. News from the next valley of a birth, a death, or a dispute was passed from cottage to cottage, acting as a kind of communal newspaper. Music and poetry were woven into their storytelling traditions in the form of ballads. These were long, epic stories of heroic battles, tragic love affairs, or historical events, all set to a simple melody and a rhyming verse. The music and rhyme made the long, complex stories easier to remember, ensuring they could be passed down accurately through the generations. The parish priest was a central figure in the village's story life. He would recount the great tales from the Bible, not in Latin, but in the common language, using simple, powerful imagery that his congregation could understand and hold in their hearts. The story of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son became powerful parables that shaped their understanding of mercy and forgiveness. Storytelling was also the way family history was kept alive. A grandparent, sitting by the fire, would tell a child the story of their ancestors, creating a powerful link to the past. They would point to a feature of the landscape and say, "Your great-grandfather was the one who first cleared that field," giving the child a deep sense of place and belonging in the world. All of these stories, shared in the intimate darkness of the winter cottage, reinforced a shared identity and worldview. They created a common set of beliefs, heroes, and fears that bound the community together. The darkness was not an emptiness to be feared, but a canvas for the imagination, a quiet incubator where the stories that defined their world could flourish. While much of the winter was about this quiet endurance, it was not an unbroken stretch of darkness. The stories and traditions pointed toward moments of light and celebration, the most important of which was the great midwinter festival. The monotony of the deep winter was broken by a period of celebration and rest that was profoundly important for the psychological well-being of the community. This was the Yuletide season, centered around the 12 days of Christmas, which stretched from Christmas Eve until Epiphany on January 6th. By order of the Lord of the Manor, this was a traditional time of rest from all agricultural labor. For people whose lives were defined by endless work, this was a rare and precious gift, a time to set down their tools and simply be together. The centerpiece of the celebration was the Yule log. This was not just any piece of firewood. It was a huge, specially chosen log, sometimes the entire root ball of a tree, found and hauled back from the forest with great ceremony. On Christmas Eve, it was brought into the cottage, sometimes decorated with greenery, and lit in the hearth from a piece of the previous year's log, symbolizing continuity. The intention was for this massive log to smolder and burn for the entire 12 days of the festival, a constant, radiant source of light and warmth that defied the darkness outside. Its ashes were considered to be very lucky and were often saved to be sprinkled on the fields in the spring. Feasting, for a peasant family, was a relative term, but it was a feast nonetheless. This was the time to finally enjoy the preserved meats from the Martinmas slaughter. A piece of salt pork, boiled to tenderness, was a taste of pure luxury. Special little cakes might be baked from oats and sweetened with a dab of precious honey. It was a time of abundance, a stark and welcome contrast to the meager rations of a normal day. One of the liveliest traditions was wassail. A group of villagers would go from door to door, carrying a large wassail bowl filled with a hot, spiced cider. They would sing carols and offer a drink from the bowl to the family inside, wishing them good health and a good harvest in the year to come. In return, they would be given a small gift of food or drink. This tradition also extended to the orchards, where villagers would sing to the apple trees and pour wassail on their roots to encourage a bountiful crop. Another form of entertainment was the mummers' play. These were simple, boisterous folk plays performed by a troupe of local peasants dressed in rough, homemade costumes and masks. The stories were always variations on a theme of death and rebirth. A hero, like St. George, would fight a villain, perhaps a comical dragon, and be tragically slain. Then, a doctor with a magic potion would arrive and bring the hero back to life. It was a wonderfully silly and symbolic piece of theater, a powerful allegory for the return of the sun after the death of winter. In the Lord's manor, a strange custom often took place: the appointing of a lord of misrule, a commoner was chosen to preside over the Christmas festivities. And for a short time, the strict social order was turned upside down. The peasant lord could order the real lord and his family around, demanding more food and drink. It was a form of social safety valve, a moment of sanctioned chaos that playfully mocked the established hierarchy before everyone returned to their proper place. Decorations were simple and natural. People brought the outside world in, tucking sprigs of holly, with its shiny green leaves and bright red berries, and lengths of ivy into the rafters of their cottages. This splash of green was a powerful symbol of everlasting life, a reminder that nature was not dead, but merely sleeping. These Christmas traditions were deeply rooted in older, pre-Christian pagan festivals that had celebrated the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and the moment the sun begins its slow, triumphant return. The Church, in its wisdom, had absorbed these powerful ancient traditions, layering the story of the birth of Christ over the older celebration of the rebirth of the light. This period of feasting, rest, and celebration was not just a luxury, it was a strategic necessity. It provided a vital boost to morale, refilling the community's emotional reserves. This shared joy would have to sustain them through the most difficult part of the year, the hunger gap of late winter, when the stored food began to dwindle. But for now, in the warm glow of the Yule log, there was food and song and laughter. The festive period provided a welcome respite. But as the great log finally burns down to embers, the reality of the long weeks still to come sets in. The stored food is noticeably smaller, forcing the peasants to turn their gaze outward once more, to the stark and frozen wilderness that surrounds them. It's so lovely to think about how stories and celebrations could be such a powerful source of light. We'd love to hear a favorite story or tradition that brings you comfort during the darker months of the year. As the festive light of the Yuletide season fades into a distant, cherished memory, the reality of the deep winter returns with a quiet and profound intensity. The world inside the cottage, with its smoky warmth and shared stories, has been a sanctuary, but it is a sanctuary with dwindling supplies. Now, with the larder at its lowest point, the peasant must once again turn their gaze outward, not to the open fields of autumn, but to the stark, silent, and frozen landscape. We venture out of the cozy embrace of the hearth into a world of white and gray, to follow the silent hunt for sustenance, a journey that demands a deep, ancient knowledge of the language of the wild. A figure moves through the trees, a stark silhouette against the endless white. They have left the relative safety of the village, stepping into the soft, muffling silence of the snow-filled forest. Here, every sound is swallowed by the snow, creating a stillness so deep it feels like the world is holding its breath. The only noise is the sharp, rhythmic crunch of leather boots on the frosted ground. This is not a hunt in the way the lord of the manor would understand it. Hunting large game, like the deer that roam these woods, is strictly forbidden. This is the king's game, and the punishment for a peasant caught poaching is swift and brutal, ranging from crippling fines to mutilation or even death. The peasant moves with a constant, low-level fear, his senses alert not only for prey, but for the lord's foresters who might be patrolling the woods. His focus, therefore, is on the small, humble creatures of the forest. He seeks rabbits, squirrels, and perhaps birds, animals that can provide a small but desperately needed addition of meat to the family pottage. His tools are not the loud bow and arrow of the noble hunter, but the silent and patient tools of the trapper. Tucked into his belt are several snares, simple but effective loops of hemp cordage, carefully crafted during the long winter evenings. A snare is a tool of knowledge, not of force. Its power lies in its placement. It must be set on a known animal trail, a tiny path through a thicket, or under a low-hanging branch that a rabbit uses every day. The hunter moves with immense patience, his eyes scanning the surface of the snow, which has become a blank page on which the forest writes its secret stories. This skill, the ability to read the snow, is a highly developed art. He stops, crouching low, to examine a set of tracks. He sees the delicate splayed prints of a rabbit. He can tell from the spacing of the prints that the animal was moving slowly, not fleeing in panic. He can see from the crispness of the edges that the tracks are fresh, made since the last light snowfall in the early morning. Every detail, every broken twig, every disturbed patch of snow tells a story to his trained eye. He is reading the landscape with an intensity born of deep familiarity and desperate need. He understands the habits of the animals he seeks. He knows that in the deep cold, rabbits will shelter in dense bramble patches, and so he moves towards a thicket, his steps slow and deliberate, conserving every bit of precious energy. The cold, biting air fills his lungs, a clean and sharp feeling that heightens his senses. The snow is both a help and a hindrance. It makes the tracks beautifully clear, but wading through the deep drifts is exhausting work. In a region like this, with heavy snowfall, he might wear simple snowshoes, wide frames made from bent ash wood and laced with leather thongs. These allow him to walk on top of the deep snow rather than sinking into it, a crucial advantage that saves precious strength. He continues on, following the trail, his movements a study in silence. He also keeps an eye out for other tracks, for the neat, single-file prints of a fox. A fox is a fellow hunter, and following its trail might lead him to an area where rabbits or other prey are more concentrated. He is not just a hunter, but an observer, a small part of the forest's larger, intricate dance of survival. Finally, he finds the perfect spot, a narrow tunnel through the brambles where the rabbit tracks are heavily concentrated. He carefully sets his snare, arranging the loop of cordage at just the right height to catch the head of a passing rabbit. He anchors it to a strong, supple branch and brushes a little snow over his own tracks to disguise his presence. Now, there is nothing to do but wait. He will not stay here. That would leave too much scent. He will continue on his way, perhaps to set another snare, and will check this one on his way back to the village. The hunt is an act of hope and patience, a quiet question posed to the forest. If he is successful, the small animal he catches will be a treasure beyond measure. Every single part of it will be used. The meat will go into the pot, providing a richness and flavor that has been absent for weeks. The soft fur will be carefully preserved and sewn together with others to make a warm lining for a child's mittens. Even the bones will be simmered for hours, releasing their last bit of nourishment into a thin but life-giving broth. A successful hunt is a rare and vital success, but the forest offered other, more reliable forms of sustenance if you knew exactly where and how to look. While the men might venture out to set snares, the crucial task of winter foraging was often the domain of the women. Theirs was a different kind of knowledge, a deep botanical wisdom, passed down from mother to daughter through countless generations. We follow a woman from the village as she makes her way to the edge of the woods, her eyes scanning the ground with a practiced and discerning gaze. She carries a simple digging stick, its tip hardened in the fire, and a rough woven basket on her back. She is searching for the forest's hidden pantry, for the small, secret sources of food that remain even in the dead of winter. Her first task is to find roots. She knows a place where burdock plants grew in abundance during the summer. The ground is frozen solid, as hard as iron, but she uses her sharp stick to chip and pry at the unyielding earth. It is slow, cold, and difficult work. After much effort, she manages to unearth a long, brown root. It is not much, but washed, boiled, and added to the pottage, it will provide nourishment and bulk. Her knowledge extends to the trees themselves. In these leanest weeks, even the bark of a tree can offer sustenance. She finds a pine tree and uses her knife to peel away the rough outer bark, revealing the softer, paler inner layer, the cambium. This layer is edible, and though it is tough and resinous, it can be dried by the fire and then ground into a coarse flour. This bark flour, mixed with what little grain flour they have left, will make the bread go further. As she moves through the snow-dusted thickets, she spots a welcome splash of color. Clinging stubbornly to the thorny branches of a wild rose bush are the bright, jewel-like red of a handful of rose hips. She gathers them carefully, her fingers numb with cold. She knows these small, hard fruits are one of the most important things she can find. As they are packed with vitamin C, a tea made from these will help to ward off the sickness and weakness that can take hold in the late winter. In a stand of oak trees, she searches for acorns that might have been missed in the autumn gathering. The acorns, she finds, are bitter and toxic if eaten raw, but she possesses the ancient knowledge to make them edible. The process is long. She will have to crack them, grind them, and then leach them in the cold running water of the stream for days, washing away the bitter tannins. It is a great deal of work, but the resulting meal is rich in fat and protein, a valuable addition to their diet. Her eyes are always alert for a stroke of luck. She notices a patch of snow under a hazel tree that looks disturbed. Kneeling down, she begins to dig with her hands, and her cold fingers soon touch something hard. It is a hidden cache of nuts, buried by a squirrel in the autumn and then forgotten. This is a gift, a moment of pure fortune that brings a rare smile to her face. These nuts are a treasure of concentrated energy. Sometimes, in the most desperate of times, people would even gather certain kinds of lichen that grew on tree branches, like the stringy moss known as old man's beard. Boiled for a long time, it offered very little in the way of nutrition, but it could fill a gnawing emptiness in the stomach. Her knowledge is also their medicine cabinet. She passes a willow tree growing by the frozen stream and peels a few strips of its bark. She knows from her mother, and her mother before her, that chewing on this bark or brewing it into a tea can help to soothe the fever or ease the ache in her husband's tired muscles. This work is not without its dangers. For many of the edible plants she seeks, there is a poisonous look-alike. Her knowledge must be precise and absolute. A single mistake could bring sickness or even death to her family. The quiet satisfaction of returning to the cottage with her basket half full of these small, hard-won treasures is immense. The earthy smell of a freshly dug root, the rough texture of the bark, the bright red of the rose hips, these are the humble ingredients of survival. These small additions from hunting and foraging were essential, but they could only supplement the dwindling stores in the larder. The village now enters the most challenging period of the winter, a time of quiet endurance, where every single meal is a careful and deliberate calculation. We have arrived at the leanest weeks, the period in late winter known to historians as the Hunger Gap. In the peasant's year, this was the starving time, typically spanning the long, cold weeks of February and March. The cheerful celebrations of midwinter are now a distant, almost dreamlike memory. The hope for spring feels faint and far away. All that remains is a quiet, collective endurance. Inside the cottage, the change is most evident in the large, black cauldron hanging over the fire. The perpetual pottage, once thick and savory, is now a thin, watery broth. The rich flavor of meat is a rarity, replaced by the earthy taste of foraged roots. To add bulk, the gritty flour made from ground tree bark might be stirred in, filling the stomach, but offering little in the way of true nourishment. The bread, the very staff of life, has also changed. It is dark and incredibly heavy, made now with only a little rye or barley flour, extended with flour made from dried peas or the leached acorns. Each slice is smaller, more precious than gold. The physical effects of this prolonged hunger begin to show on the faces and bodies of the family. A deep fatigue settles into their bones. Movements become slower, more deliberate, as each person instinctively conserves their precious energy. The gnawing, persistent feeling of hunger is a constant companion. This physical weakness makes them more vulnerable to sickness, and a simple cough can now linger for weeks, a dangerous drain on their limited strength. Within the family, food is strictly and silently rationed. It is a painful and unspoken calculation based on the needs of the future. The father of the family, who will soon need immense strength to guide the heavy plow through the wet spring soil, may receive a slightly larger share of the bread. The children's portions are measured with a heavy heart. It is the brutal logic of survival. This suffering is not limited to the people. In the small byre attached to the cottage, the family's animals are also growing weaker. The fodder, stored in the autumn, is nearly gone. The precious milk cow is thin, her ribs visible beneath her hide. She chews listlessly on dried leaves and whatever scraps can be found for her. Her milk, if she produces any at all, is thin and blue. This is a time of immense psychological strain. Hope is not a passive feeling, but an active resource that must be carefully cultivated. It is nurtured by the familiar routines of the day, by the stories told around the fire, and by the shared, unspoken understanding that they are all in this together. And in these hardest of times, the bonds of community become more important than ever. A family that was lucky with a snare does not hoard its small prize. A portion of the rabbit will be shared with a neighbor whose luck has run out. This system of reciprocity, of shared hardship and mutual support, is the invisible thread that holds the village together. Faith also deepens. The small stone church may be cold, but it is filled with villagers seeking comfort and deliverance in their prayers. They look to their faith as an anchor in this sea of hardship, a promise that their suffering will not last forever. In the corner of the cottage sits the ultimate symbol of this struggle between the present and the future: the sacks of seed grain. This grain, set aside from the autumn harvest, represents all their hopes for the coming year. It is also, tantalizingly, a source of food that could ease the immediate, gnawing hunger. But every single person in the cottage, even the youngest child, understands that to eat the seed grain is to eat their own future. It is a temptation that must be resisted at all costs. It is guarded with a fierce and desperate reverence, a testament to their enduring hope. And so they wait, their gazes often turning to the small, shuttered window, searching the gray sky for any sign, any hint at all that spring might be on its way. After a long, seemingly endless period of this quiet, watchful waiting, a subtle change begins to occur. It is not a sudden or dramatic event, but a gradual shift in the world outside. A new sound, a new smell, a new quality to the light that signals the end of the long struggle. The first sign of the thaw is often heard before it is seen. After months of muffled silence, a new sound enters the world. The gentle, persistent asterisk drip, 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 asterisk of water, as the long icicles on the eaves of the cottage finally begin to melt in a sun that has a new and unfamiliar strength. It is the first note in the symphony of spring, a sound of profound and unbelievable hope. As the days pass, the snow cover begins to recede, exposing patches of dark, damp earth. And on one of these patches, near the south-facing wall of the cottage, a tiny miracle appears. The first vibrant green shoots pushing their way up through the mud. These are stinging nettles, and they are greeted not as a weed, but as a gift. The woman of the house carefully gathers the tender young leaves, and that evening, for the first time in months, the family has a fresh green soup, a taste of life itself. The days themselves are changing. The change is subtle at first, but everyone feels it. The sun stays in the sky a little longer each afternoon, and its light seems warmer, less pale and watery. For a few more precious minutes each day, the cottage is filled with natural light, a powerful tonic for the weary spirit. From the nearby river comes a new sound, a deep groaning and cracking, as the thick sheet of ice that has covered it for months finally begins to break apart. The dark, living water flows freely once more, a promise that fishing can soon resume. And then one morning, another sound returns to the silent forest. It is the clear, bright song of a bird, a sound that has been absent for so long. It is a definitive announcement that winter's hold is truly broken. There is no time for rest. The work of spring begins almost immediately. As the last of the snow melts, the men are out in the fields, clearing them of stones that the frost has heaved to the surface. The heavy wooden plow is brought out from the barn, its iron tip sharpened, ready for the oxen to pull it through the awakening soil. The sacred seed grain is finally brought out into the sunlight. It is carefully inspected, each perfect kernel a vessel of hope for the entire next year. There is no loud celebration in the village, no great festival. Instead, there is a collective, unspoken sigh of relief. It is a feeling that passes between neighbors in a shared glance, a genuine smile. There is a new lightness in their steps. The very air itself has changed. It has lost its sharp, biting, sterile edge, and now carries the rich, deep, and loamy smell of damp, thawing earth. It is the smell of life, of possibility, of renewal. This moment is the true victory, a triumph, not of a glorious battle, but of quiet, stubborn, collective endurance. And so, with the gentle sound of melting snow and the first notes of birdsong, the long siege of winter comes to a quiet end. It's a victory marked not by a grand celebration, but by a collective, grateful breath and the turning of faces toward the sun's returning warmth. Our journey has shown us that survival was not just about enduring the cold, but about the warmth of community. The light of shared stories and the deep, abiding knowledge that even after the longest darkness, life always, always returns. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it brought you some peace and comfort. We'd love to know what part of this peasant's winter world resonated with you the most. As the first tentative signs of the thaw begin to rewrite the landscape, our journey through the medieval peasant's winter draws to a gentle close. We have walked with the villagers through the frantic energy of the last harvest. We have huddled with them in the smoky warmth of the hearth, and we have felt the quiet gnawing of the hunger gap. But to truly understand how they survived, we must now turn our gaze away from the physical world of grain and firewood and look instead to the invisible forces that held their world together. In this final, quiet reflection, we will explore the intricate bonds of justice, faith, and unwritten law that were forged and tempered in the profound isolation of the winter months, creating a social fabric strong enough to endure even the longest and darkest of nights. When the snows fell deep and the paths to the wider world became impassable, the medieval village became an island, a self-contained world with its own distinct rhythm and order. In this enforced isolation, justice did not cease to exist. It simply became a more local and intimate affair. The primary instrument of governance was the manorial court, a regular assembly that handled the vast majority of local disputes and administrative tasks. The lord of the manor, a distant and often abstract figure of authority, would rarely be present. Instead, the court was typically presided over by his steward, or more often, by the village's own reeve, a peasant chosen for his good sense and standing among his peers. This meant that the face of the law was not that of a stranger, but of a neighbor, a man they saw and spoke with every single day. This court was not a grand or intimidating affair. It might convene in the drafty great hall of the manor house, if one was nearby, or even within the cold stone walls of the village church, its sacred space temporarily serving a civic purpose. Here, surrounded by familiar faces, the community managed its own affairs. One of the most remarkable aspects of this system was its reliance on a jury of the villagers themselves. For most cases, a panel of 12 men, usually the more established freeholders of the village, would be called upon to hear the evidence and pass judgment. Imagine the scene: a dozen men with faces weathered by the sun and wind, their hands calloused from a lifetime of labor, gathered together to deliberate. Theirs was not a judgment based on complex legal texts or abstract principles, but on a deep, lived understanding of the community's customs and the unwritten rules of neighborly conduct. They listened to the arguments, their expressions thoughtful and serious, knowing that the harmony of their small world depended on the fairness of their decisions. The cases brought before the winter court often reflected the specific pressures of the season. With resources scarce, disputes could easily flare up. One man might accuse another of gathering more than his fair share of firewood from the common woods, a serious offense when every log was precious, an accusation of the theft of stored food. A few handfuls of grain from a sack or a small piece of salted meat from a barrel was treated with the utmost gravity. And sometimes the disputes were simply the result of human nature, of old arguments, and simmering resentments between families that, festered by the close quarters and enforced idleness of winter, finally boiled over into a formal complaint. The punishments handed down by the manorial court were rarely brutal or violent. The goal was not vengeance, but the restoration of social harmony. The most common punishment was a simple fine, and interestingly, these fines were often paid not in coin, which was rare, but in goods. A man found guilty of starting a brawl might be fined a cask of ale. This ale would then often be shared among the members of the jury and the rest of the community, a symbolic act that turned a moment of conflict into an occasion for communal reconciliation. For more serious offenses against the social order, public shaming was a powerful tool. Being sentenced to a day in the stocks or the pillory, where you would be subjected to the ridicule of your neighbors, was a profoundly effective way of reinforcing the unspoken rules of the village. The shame of being publicly disgraced was a punishment in itself, a stark reminder of the importance of maintaining a good reputation among your peers. The court was not only for settling disputes, it was also the official record keeper of the village. It was here that land tenancies were formally witnessed and recorded, ensuring that the transfer of a family's precious strips of land from one generation to the next was recognized by the entire community. It was here that local bylaws were created and agreed upon, simple rules that governed daily life, such as when livestock could be grazed on the common fields after the harvest, or who was responsible for maintaining the village's fences and paths. These sessions formally outlined the duties and obligations of every villager, making it clear that everyone had a role to play in the functioning of their small society. Perhaps the most important aspect of this legal system was that it was based almost entirely on custom and precedent. This was the law of the village, a collection of traditions and past decisions passed down through generations. When a difficult case arose, the jury would often deliberate by recalling similar disputes from the past. A village elder might say, "I remember when this same argument over a straying pig happened between old Thomas and John's father, and the court decided then that the owner of the pig must pay for the damage to the garden." This reliance on collective memory reinforced the deep authority of tradition and ensured a sense of continuity and fairness. It meant that the law was not an alien thing imposed from the outside, but something that belonged to the community itself. This entire system fostered a profound sense of accountability. The knowledge that any transgression, any act of selfishness or dishonesty could result in you having to stand before your own neighbors and explain your actions was a powerful deterrent. It was a system built on the unavoidable reality of their lives. In a small, isolated village, you could not hide from the consequences of your behavior. This created a strong social pressure to act honorably and to settle disputes peacefully whenever possible. In a society that we often think of as rigidly hierarchical and oppressive, these manorial courts represented a surprisingly democratic element. They gave ordinary peasants a voice, a role in their own governance, and a genuine measure of control over their daily lives. Their opinions, their experiences, and their collective judgment mattered deeply. And for historians today, the dusty handwritten records of these humble courts provide one of the richest and most intimate sources of information we have, offering an unfiltered window into the arguments, the struggles, and the enduring social order of everyday peasant life. But the laws of the manor, for all their importance in governing daily life, existed alongside a much older and in some ways deeper set of beliefs, a system of understanding that sought to explain the turning of the seasons and the great mysteries of the world, a faith whose whispers felt particularly potent in the deep, profound darkness of the winter. While the medieval village was officially and devoutly Christian, the roots of its spiritual life ran much deeper than the foundations of the parish church. The older, pre-Christian beliefs of their ancestors had never been entirely erased. Instead, they had blended with the new faith in a complex and beautiful tapestry of belief, a process scholars call syncretism. The old ways were not seen as a rival faith, but rather as a kind of folk wisdom, a practical and ancient layer of understanding that coexisted peacefully with the teachings of the priest. This blending was most apparent during the Yuletide celebrations. The very symbols that we still associate with Christmas have deep roots in the pagan winter solstice festivals. The great Yule log, burning in the hearth, was an ancient echo of the pagan need to keep the fires of the sun alive during the shortest, darkest day of the year. The practice of bringing holly and ivy indoors was a powerful, magical act, a way of inviting the spirit of everlasting life into the home during a season when the world outside seemed dead. The mistletoe hung in doorways was a sacred plant to the ancient Druids, a symbol of peace and fertility. These were not Christian symbols, but they had been so deeply woven into the fabric of the midwinter festival that they were accepted as part of the tradition. For the medieval peasant, the world was alive with unseen forces. A widespread belief in fairies, elves, and other nature spirits populated the landscape with beings that were not necessarily evil, but were seen as powerful, unpredictable, and easily offended. These beings, often called the little folk or the good neighbors, had to be shown respect. A farmer might leave a small offering, a bowl of cream, or a piece of bread, on a particular stone at the edge of his field to ensure the goodwill of the spirits who resided there, hoping they would not blight his crops or cause his cow to go dry. This was a form of insurance, a way of maintaining a respectful relationship with the powerful, invisible world that existed alongside their own. Certain places in the landscape were believed to hold a special power, serving as focal points for this lingering old faith. An ancient, gnarled oak tree on a hilltop, a peculiar outcropping of rocks that resembled a sleeping giant, or a spring that bubbled up from the earth with pure, cold water. These were all considered sacred spaces. Long after the village had converted to Christianity, these places retained their aura of mystery and significance, and people might still visit them to make a quiet wish or to seek healing. To navigate this world of invisible forces, people relied on a host of protective charms and amulets, especially during the vulnerable and dangerous months of winter. A piece of iron, a metal believed to repel evil spirits, was often nailed over the doorway of a cottage. A small, smooth stone with a natural hole in it might be carried in a pocket as a charm for good luck. These were not seen as acts of defiance against the church, but as simple, practical measures of extra protection. In the same way that one would patch a roof to keep out the rain, the long, dark nights of winter, with the wind howling and rattling the shutters, gave rise to some of the most powerful and terrifying pieces of folklore. Chief among these was the belief in the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of spectral hunters and baying hounds that was said to ride through the sky during winter storms. To be caught outside and witness the hunt was considered a terrible omen, a portent of plague or war. The terrifying sound of a winter gale shrieking through the trees was not just weather, it was the sound of the hunt, a supernatural explanation for the awesome and frightening power of nature. In this world, where illness could strike suddenly and without a clear cause, people often turned to the cunning folk, the village healers, and wise women who possessed a deep knowledge of both the natural and the supernatural worlds. Their craft was a delicate mixture of practical herbal medicine and what we would now call folk magic. They would gather herbs, roots, and barks, but the remedies they created were often accompanied by the recitation of a specific charm or the performance of a small ritual. A poultice for a wound might be applied while saying a prayer to a particular saint, seamlessly blending Christian faith with older healing traditions. Many of the folk tales that were told around the fire on winter nights carried the faint echoes of these old myths and legends. A story about a clever peasant boy who tricks a clumsy giant might have its distant origins in an ancient myth about a human hero outwitting a pagan god. In this way, the old stories were not lost, but were preserved and passed down, their original meanings hidden but their narrative power intact. The Church, for its part, often struggled with how to respond to these deeply ingrained beliefs. While some priests tried to stamp them out as sinful superstition, a more common and practical approach was to simply absorb them. A sacred spring, known for its healing properties, might be rededicated to a Christian saint, becoming a saint's well. A pagan festival marking the start of spring might be incorporated into the Christian calendar as a saint's day. This allowed people to continue their traditional practices within an officially Christian framework. This rich and complex blend of beliefs provided the medieval peasant with a multi-layered way of understanding a world that was often mysterious and beyond their control. It was a world where a prayer to God for a good harvest could exist alongside leaving an offering for the field spirits. It was a worldview that left nothing unexplained, attributing every creak of the cottage and every howl of the wind to the vibrant, living, and deeply mysterious forces that surrounded them. And while these older whispers of faith persisted in the shadows, the dominant spiritual and social force in the village, the ultimate anchor in the storm of winter, was the parish church. In the heart of the village, often the only building constructed of stone, stood the parish church. In a world of wood, wattle, and daub, its solid permanence was a powerful symbol of security and of the enduring presence of God. During the isolating weeks of winter, the church's role as the spiritual and social center of the community became more vital than ever. It was a sanctuary in every sense of the word. While most churches were unheated and could be drafty and cold, they offered a physical refuge from the biting wind and driving snow of a blizzard. Its thick stone walls represented a fortress against the chaos of the winter world outside, a safe and hallowed space where the community could gather. More than just a physical shelter, the church provided a structure for time itself. In the deep winter, when one day could feel exactly like the next, the rhythm of the church calendar gave shape and meaning to the formless weeks. The season of Advent was a period of quiet, hopeful waiting. The festival of Christmas was a joyful explosion of light and celebration in the midwinter darkness. The Feast of the Epiphany marked the end of the festive season, and the coming of Lent signaled a time for sober reflection, leading the community slowly toward the promise of Easter and the rebirth of the world in spring. At the center of this spiritual life was the parish priest. He was often a humble figure, a man born of the peasant class himself, and usually the only person in the village who could read and write. His role extended far beyond simply celebrating Mass. He was the keeper of the community's official records, noting the births, marriages, and deaths that marked the passage of generations. He was a source of news from the outside world, perhaps sharing a letter he had received from a distant bishop. Above all, he was the spiritual guide for his flock, offering comfort, counsel, and the reassuring rituals of the faith. For the deeply isolated villagers, the weekly gathering for Sunday Mass was a crucial social event. After a week spent largely confined to their own small cottages, it was the one opportunity for the entire community to come together. In the moments before and after the service, people would exchange news in hushed tones, check on the welfare of their neighbors, and simply reaffirm their connection to one another. The simple act of standing together in a shared space was a powerful antidote to the loneliness and anxiety of the winter months. For the vast majority of the congregation who were illiterate, the church itself served as their Bible. The interior walls were often covered in colorful paintings, murals depicting the great stories of the faith. A peasant could look up and see the dramatic story of Adam and Eve's expulsion from paradise, the tender scene of the Nativity, or the terrifying and awe-inspiring depiction of the Last Judgment, with angels guiding the saved to heaven and demons dragging the damned to hell. These vivid images were a constant and powerful sermon in paint and plaster, teaching the core tenets of the faith in a way that everyone could understand. The rituals of the church also offered a profound psychological release. The sacrament of confession, for instance, was a vital outlet for the stresses and resentments that could build up in the claustrophobic environment of winter. The chance to speak of one's sins and fears to the priest and to receive absolution and forgiveness was a powerful way to ease the burdens of the heart and to restore a sense of inner peace. The soundscape of the village was dominated by the church bell. Its resonant peal marked the hours of the day, a reliable and comforting guide in a world without clocks. It called people to worship, its sound carrying for miles across the snowy landscape, a unifying signal to the entire parish. For someone working alone in the silent winter woods, the distant sound of the bell was a comforting reminder that they were not alone, that they were still connected to the heart of their community. Just outside the church walls lay the graveyard, a constant and gentle reminder of the village's continuity. Here, under simple wooden crosses, lay the generations of ancestors who had worked the same fields and endured the same winters. To walk through the graveyard was to feel a deep connection to the past, a sense of being part of a long, unbroken chain of life, death, and faith. In the midst of the hunger gap, when bellies were empty and the cold was relentless, the ultimate comfort offered by the church was the promise of a better life to come. The belief in an eternal heaven, a paradise where there would be no hunger, no suffering, and no cold, was a powerful source of hope that sustained people through their darkest hours. It was this deep and abiding faith that provided the ultimate framework for life, but the day-to-day, moment-to-moment interactions of the villagers were governed by a more immediate and personal set of unwritten rules. The law of the village, beneath the formal structures of the manorial court and the parish church, there existed a deeper and more ancient set of rules, an unwritten social code that governed the everyday interactions of the villagers. This was the true law of the village, a complex system of mutual obligation, reciprocity, and community support that was absolutely essential for survival, never more so than during the intense pressures of winter. The core principle of this unwritten law was reciprocity, the simple and powerful idea of I help you today, so that you will help me tomorrow. This was not a calculated exchange, but a deeply ingrained mindset. It governed countless small acts, from borrowing a tool to sharing food. A woman whose fire had gone out would not hesitate to go to a neighbor to ask for a glowing ember to rekindle her own hearth, knowing that she would gladly do the same in return. This constant flow of small favors and mutual assistance was the lifeblood of the community. Gossip, a force so often seen as negative, played a crucial and complex role in this system. It served as the village's information network, a way of policing behavior and enforcing social norms without resorting to the formal court. If a man was known to be lazy and did not contribute his fair share of labor to a communal task, the quiet disapproval of his neighbors, expressed through gossip, would create a powerful pressure for him to change his ways. A person's reputation was their single most valuable asset. In a small, close-knit community where you interacted with the same people every single day, being known as honest, hardworking, and generous was the key to your entire social and economic well-being. To earn a reputation for being selfish or untrustworthy could lead to social ostracism, a devastating fate in a world where survival depended entirely on the cooperation of others. While the nuclear family was the primary unit of support, the entire village was conditioned to function as an extended family in times of crisis. If a man fell ill and could not bring in his harvest, the other men of the village would work his fields for him, not as an act of charity, but as an act of communal responsibility. They knew that if tragedy struck their own family, the community would do the same for them. Respected figures, like the village midwife, embodied this principle. She assisted in the birth of nearly every child in the community, and her payment was not a set fee, but a lifetime of reciprocal support from the families she had helped. She would receive a share of the pork at the autumn slaughter, a regular supply of eggs, or help with her own chores, all part of the unwritten law of mutual obligation. This communal mindset was often expressed through working bees, occasions where the entire village would come together to complete a large task that would be impossible for a single family to manage alone. If a cottage roof was damaged in a winter storm, the community would mobilize. The men would work together to cut and haul the timber for repairs. The women would prepare food and drink for the workers, and everyone would contribute to the task of rethatching. A job that might take one family weeks could be accomplished by the community in a single day. The commons, the shared land in the village that was used for grazing animals or gathering firewood, was a physical manifestation of this collective ethos. It was a resource that belonged to everyone, and therefore it was everyone's shared responsibility to maintain it and ensure it was not overused. It was a daily, practical lesson in cooperation and shared stewardship. Ultimately, these unwritten laws of village life were often far more powerful than the formal laws of the manor. The authority of the reeve or the steward might be respected, but the approval or disapproval of your next-door neighbor, the person you relied on every single day, was a more immediate and influential force. The isolation and shared hardship of the winter months did not break these bonds of community. On the contrary, the winter was the very forge in which these bonds were tempered and made strong. The constant, shared struggle against the cold and the hunger stripped away trivialities and reinforced the essential truth of their existence. They would either survive together, or they would not survive at all. And so we see that the true strength of the medieval village was not just in its stored grain or sturdy walls, but in the invisible threads of connection that wove the community into a single, resilient whole. These bonds of law, faith, and mutual support were the true hearth that kept the soul of the village warm through the longest winter. We hope this reflection has been a peaceful one for you. As you continue to unwind, let these thoughts of quiet community gently guide you toward rest. As our story of the medieval peasant's winter draws to its peaceful conclusion. We can now settle into a final, quiet reflection. We have witnessed the grand rhythms of community, but now we turn our attention to the small, tangible details of everyday life. This is a gentle exploration of the tools, the materials, and the quiet, patient skills that formed the very texture of their world. There is no narrative tension here, no struggle to overcome. There is only a slow, detailed, and atmospheric portrait of the peasant's toolkit, a soothing meditation on the simple ingenuity that allowed life to flourish. Let us begin by considering the most fundamental material of all, the very substance from which their world was built, the wood of the forest. For the medieval peasant, the forest was not just a landscape, it was a living library of materials, and they were fluent in its language. The grandest and most respected of all the trees was the mighty oak. To stand before a mature oak was to feel a sense of permanence and strength. Its bark was a landscape in itself, a tapestry of deep grooves and rugged ridges. Its branches, thick and gnarled, reached out like powerful arms. The peasant knew that this wood was the ultimate symbol of durability. When a new cottage was to be built, it was the trunk of an oak, painstakingly felled and shaped with an asset that would form the main structural beam, the solid backbone of the home. This oak beam, known as the cruck, would hold the weight of the roof, and with it, the safety of the family, a silent and steadfast guardian against the wind and snow. The peasant understood its dense, heavy grain and its resistance to rot, and they respected it as the king of the woods. If oak was the bones of their world, then ash was its muscle and sinew. Ash wood was a marvel of natural engineering, possessing both incredible strength and a surprising degree of flexibility. The peasant knew that a tool was only as good as its handle, and for handles there was nothing better than ash. When you hold an axe with a handle carved from ash, you can feel how the wood absorbs the shock of each blow, preventing the vibration from jarring your arms and shoulders. Its grain is straight and true, and when shaped and sanded, it has a smooth, satisfying feel in the hand. The handles of their shovels, their hay forks, and the heavy flails used for threshing grain were all made from ash, a wood that could bend without breaking, a perfect partner for a lifetime of hard labor. While oak and ash provided strength, other woods were valued for their pliability. The walls of a peasant cottage were not solid, but were constructed from panels of woven wood called wattle. For this, the peasant turned to the slender, supple branches of the hazel tree. Hazel grows in dense thickets, sending up long, straight rods that are easily harvested. These rods, when freshly cut, could be bent and woven into an intricate lattice, a strong yet light framework that formed the skeleton of the walls. The process of weaving the wattle was a quiet and rhythmic task, the hazel branches creating a pleasing, repeating pattern that was soon to be covered with daub, but which remained as the hidden, flexible strength within the home. Near the streams and rivers grew the willow, another tree prized for its willingness to bend. The long, slender shoots of the willow, known as osiers, were the primary material for basketry. The peasant would harvest these shoots and often soak them in water to make them even more pliable. Then, in the quiet hours of a winter evening, the work of weaving would begin. The rhythmic, in-and-out motion of the weaver's hands would transform the simple willow branches into strong, light, and incredibly useful baskets. These containers were essential for every aspect of their lives, used for carrying everything from freshly gathered eggs to heavy loads of firewood. A well-made willow basket was a perfect example of peasant ingenuity. A beautiful and functional object created from the simplest of materials. 4 objects that came into contact with food. A different kind of wood was needed. Here, the fine-grained beech was the wood of choice. When you look closely at a piece of beech wood, you see a smooth, almost featureless surface with a pale, creamy color. The peasant knew that this wood was ideal for carving the simple bowls and spoons that they used every day. Its dense grain meant that it could be carved to a very smooth finish, and most importantly, it did not have a strong taste or scent that could taint the flavor of the food. To hold a simple hand-carved beechwood spoon, worn smooth and cool from years of use, is to feel a direct connection to the quiet domestic heart of the peasant's world. While many wooden items were carved by hand, some peasants had access to a simple but ingenious machine for creating rounded objects, the pole lathe. This was a human-powered device. A cord was wrapped around the piece of wood to be shaped, with one end attached to a flexible sapling or pole above, and the other end attached to a foot pedal or treadle below. Pushing down on the treadle would spin the wood, and as the pole sprang back up, the wood would spin in the reverse direction. The wood turner would apply their chisel only on the downstroke, creating a rhythmic pump, spin, and cut. The gentle hum of the spinning wood and the soft scraping sound of the chisel would fill the workshop as shavings curled away. And a perfectly rounded chair leg or a simple bowl would slowly emerge from a rough block of wood. In a world where iron was a rare and expensive commodity, the peasant relied on wood for nearly every aspect of construction. Instead of using iron nails, they joined wooden beams together, using wooden pegs, often called tree nails. A hole would be drilled through 2 pieces of wood with a tool called an auger, and then a seasoned, oversized peg, usually made of oak, would be hammered forcefully into the hole. This created an incredibly strong and durable joint that would hold for centuries, a testament to the simple, effective solutions that could be achieved with a deep understanding of the properties of wood. Even the simple act of building a fire required a sophisticated knowledge of different wood types. The peasant knew that dense hardwoods, like oak or beech, would burn long and slow, creating a bed of hot embers that could last through the night, providing a gentle, radiant heat. Softer woods, like pine or birch, were much better for kindling, as they would catch fire quickly and produce a bright, hot flame, perfect for getting a fire started, or for providing a quick burst of heat for cooking. Their woodpile was not a random collection of logs, but a carefully curated supply of different fuels for different purposes. This intimate understanding of wood was not something learned from books. It was a vast and detailed encyclopedia of knowledge, acquired over a lifetime of tactile experience. The peasant knew the character of each tree just by the look of its bark, the feel of its grain, and the weight of it in their hand. Their entire world of woodworking was made possible by just a few simple, essential tools. There was the heavy-headed axe used for felling trees and splitting logs. There was the adze, a tool with a curved blade used for shaping and smoothing the surface of large beams. There was the simple knife, the universal tool for the finer work of carving and whittling. And there was the auger, a T-shaped tool with a screw-like tip used for drilling the clean, round holes needed for joinery. In the skilled and patient hands of the peasant, these few humble tools were enough to build a home, to craft a cradle, to shape a bowl, and to create the entire material world in which they lived. From the wood that built and warmed the home, our thoughts now drift towards the heart of it, to the central hearth, and to the simple but vital implements of the kitchen. Let us now take a gentle tour of the medieval peasant's kitchen, a space defined not by countertops and cupboards, but by the warm, living presence of the open fire. Here, the tools were few, simple, and designed for a lifetime of use. The methods were not based on written recipes, but on a deep, intuitive understanding of how to transform the raw ingredients from the field and forest into warm, nourishing meals. This was the quiet alchemy of the kitchen, a daily miracle of sustenance, performed with the most basic of equipment. The undisputed heart of all cooking was the cauldron. This was a large, heavy pot, usually made of cast iron or sometimes bronze, with a rounded belly and 3 short legs that allowed it to stand stably in the embers of the fire. It was often the single most valuable object a family owned, passed down from one generation to the next. The cauldron was a vessel of endless possibility. It was in here that the perpetual pottage simmered day and night, a comforting and ever-changing stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever else was available. It was also used for boiling water, for rendering fat from the autumn slaughter, and for any task that required the slow, gentle application of heat. To feel the solid, reassuring weight of a cauldron is to understand its central importance in the peasant home. On the rarest of special occasions, such as the Christmas feast, a different kind of cooking might take place. For this, a spit was used. This was a long, straight rod, sometimes of iron, but often just a sturdy pole of green wood that would not burn easily. A small bird or a piece of precious meat would be skewered on the spit and suspended over the fire. The task of turning the spit, slowly and constantly, was often given to a child. The sound of the fat sizzling and dripping into the flames, and the incredible aroma of roasting meat that would fill the smoky cottage, was a sensory experience of pure luxury, a memory to be cherished for months to come. The other essential vessels of the kitchen were made not of metal, but of clay. The pottery of the peasant household was simple, humble earthenware. The shapes were practical and timeless. Wide-mouthed bowls for eating, tall jugs with a single handle for storing water or ale, and shallow dishes for baking. Most of this pottery was unglazed, with a porous, earthy texture. Some pieces might have a simple lead glaze on the inside, which gave the clay a greenish, glassy sheen and made it waterproof. To hold a simple clay jug, to feel its coolness against your hands and the slight imperfections of its hand-thrown shape, is to appreciate the beauty of pure, unadorned function. While the lord of the manor had his grain ground at a large, water-powered mill, a peasant family would often grind smaller amounts of grain for their daily needs by hand. For this, they used a quernstone. This tool consisted of 2 heavy, circular stones, one placed on top of the other. The top stone had a handle and a hole in the center, through which the grain was fed. The slow, rhythmic work of turning the top stone would crush the grains between the 2 textured surfaces, and a coarse flour would slowly emerge from the edges. The gritty, scraping sound of stone on stone, and the dusty, sweet smell of freshly ground flour, was the sound and scent of the very beginning of bread. Once the flour was ground, it needed to be sifted. This was done with a simple sieve, made from a circular wooden frame, over which a mesh of tightly woven horsehair was stretched. The flour would be placed in the sieve, which was then gently shaken back and forth. This simple action separated the finer particles of flour, which fell through the mesh, from the coarser pieces of bran and husk. This bran was never wasted, but would be added to the pottage to provide extra fiber and bulk. The humble sieve was a simple tool of refinement, a way of bringing a little more delicacy to their staple food. In the peasant kitchen, the knife was the universal utensil. Forks were not in common use, and a single all-purpose knife was used for almost every task. It would be used to slice vegetables for the cauldron, to cut a hunk of dark bread from the loaf, and then, at mealtime, to carry the food to the mouth. These knives often had simple wooden handles and soft iron blades that lost their edge quickly and needed frequent sharpening on a whetstone. The absence of a fork meant that a piece of bread, known as a trencher, was often used as an edible plate and tool for sopping up the juices from the pottage. For the task of grinding smaller items, such as herbs, spices, or a handful of nuts, a mortar and pestle was used. This was usually a heavy bowl carved from stone or a dense wood, accompanied by a rounded grinding tool. The gentle, percussive sound of the pestle crushing dried thyme or a few peppercorns would release their intense aromas, adding a welcome burst of flavor to the often bland winter diet. It was a simple tool that could transform a meal with the ghost of summer's scents. While simple oatcakes or flatbreads could be cooked on a stone in the hearth, the high, even heat required for baking a proper loaf of bread was difficult to achieve in an open fire. Because of this, many villages had a communal oven, often owned by the lord, to whom the villagers would have to pay a small fee for its use. Baking day was a social event, with the women of the village carrying their carefully shaped and risen loaves to the oven, a shared moment of creation that resulted in the warm, life-sustaining bread that was the cornerstone of their diet. For the quicker, daily breads, a griddle stone was the perfect tool. This was a large, flat, smooth stone that was placed directly in the hot embers at the side of the hearth. Once the stone was searingly hot, a simple, wet dough of oats or barley flour would be dropped onto it, where it would sizzle and cook through in minutes, providing a warm, satisfying flatbread to be eaten immediately. The true, unspoken skill of the medieval cook was not in following recipes, but in the art of managing the fire. Their relationship with the hearth was an intimate dance of heat and intuition. They knew exactly where to place the cauldron for a rapid boil and where to move it for a long, slow simmer. They understood how to build up the embers to heat the griddle stone, and how to let the fire die down to a gentle glow that would keep the pottage warm through the night. This deep, practical knowledge was the silent, essential ingredient in every meal. The nourishment provided by this simple alchemy fueled the body for the quiet, patient work of the hands. And so our thoughts now lead us to the gentle art of making cloth. Let us now settle into a calm and detailed meditation on one of the most essential and time-consuming of all the peasant crafts, the transformation of raw wool into finished cloth. This was a journey that began with the sheep in the field and ended with the simple, durable garments worn by the family. It was a process defined by patience, by rhythm, and by the quiet, hypnotic repetition of gentle actions. We will follow this journey step by step as a way of understanding the immense labor and skill that was woven into every single thread of their world. The journey begins with the raw fleece shorn from the sheep in the spring. This wool is not the clean white fiber we might imagine. It is heavy and greasy with a natural oil called lanolin, and it is tangled with bits of dirt, straw, and burrs from the pasture. The first step is to wash it. The wool would be taken to a nearby stream or soaked in large wooden tubs of water. The women would work the fibers with their hands, squeezing and rinsing, the water slowly turning cloudy as it washed away the lanolin and the dirt. After repeated rinsings, the wool would be laid out to dry, and it would become a soft, springy, and surprisingly light pile of clean fiber. The next step was to prepare these fibers for spinning. For this, a pair of carding combs was used. These were two wooden paddles, much like large butter pats, and their surfaces were covered with rows of fine, sharp iron teeth, like a brush. A handful of the clean wool would be placed on one comb, and the other comb would be pulled across it again and again. This gentle, repetitive motion would tease apart any remaining clumps and align all the individual wool fibers so that they lay in the same direction. The result of this calming, rhythmic work was a light, airy cloud of wool called a bat or a rolag, where all the fibers were perfectly prepared for the magic of spinning. The spinning itself was done with a simple, ancient tool, the drop spindle. The spinner would hold a distaff, a short staff, on which the cloud of carded wool was loosely wound. With one hand, she would gently draw out a few fibers from the distaff, and with the other, she would give a sharp twist to the top of the spindle, a weighted wooden stick with a notch in the top to catch the thread. She would then release the spindle, and as it dropped towards the floor, its weight and momentum would cause it to spin hypnotically, twisting the loose fibers into a continuous, strong thread. When the spindle reached the floor, she would stop its motion, wind the newly created length of yarn onto the body of the spindle, catch the thread in the notch once more, and repeat the process. It was a slow, beautiful rhythm of pull, twist, spin, and wind. To create a thread that was consistent in its thickness and strong enough not to break required immense practice. A beginner's yarn would be lumpy and weak, thick in some places and thin in others. But a skilled spinner, who had been practicing the art since she was a young girl, could produce a thread that was remarkably fine and even. This skill was the result of thousands upon thousands of hours of patient, quiet work, a deep and intuitive connection between her hands, the fibers, and the spinning spindle. Once a full spindle of yarn had been created, it would be wound off into a large loop, or hank. This yarn would then be washed again to set the twist, and sometimes it would be dyed. The hanks of yarn would be submerged in a large pot kept warm by the hearth, which was filled with water and the natural materials that produced color. The earthy smell of a dye pot filled with onion skins, slowly turning the yarn a soft, gentle yellow, was a common scent. Other colors were possible, too. The leaves of the woad plant could produce a range of blues, and the precious root of the madder plant was used to create a deep, rusty red. To watch the plain yarn slowly taking on a new color was to witness a quiet and wonderful transformation. With the yarn now prepared, the final stage of creating cloth could begin, the weaving. The spun and dyed yarn would be carefully set up on a simple, vertical hand loom. The process of arranging the hundreds of vertical threads, known as the warp, was painstaking. Each thread had to be stretched with an even tension, as this would form the very foundation of the cloth. Once the warp was in place, the weaving itself could start. The horizontal threads, called the weft, would be wound onto a simple wooden shuttle. This shuttle would then be passed from one side of the loom to the other, in between the threads of the warp. After each pass, a wooden bar would be used to beat the new weft thread down, packing it tightly against the previous row. The quiet, steady, rhythmic clack-thump of a hand loom at work was one of the most common and comforting sounds of the winter cottage. The finished cloth that came off the loom was not soft or luxurious. It was a rough, coarse, and incredibly durable fabric known as homespun. It was often still slightly oily with the natural lanolin from the wool, which gave it a degree of water resistance. This was a fabric made for warmth and for work, a practical and honest material that reflected the life of the people who made it. While wool was the most common fiber, another plant, flax, was also cultivated to make linen. The process of creating thread from flax was even more complex, involving a stage called retting, where the woody stalks of the plant were left to rot in water, releasing the long, silky fibers from within. These fibers could then be spun into a thread that was smoother and cooler than wool, and the resulting linen cloth was often used for undergarments. From the shearing of the sheep to the final sewing of a simple tunic, the entire process of creating clothing could take hundreds of hours of patient, dedicated labor. It was a journey that followed the slow, natural rhythms of the seasons and the work of human hands. It stands as a profound testament to the quiet patience of the peasant and to the deep understanding that truly valuable things are created slowly, gently, and one thread at a time. The knowledge of these crafts was part of a larger, unwritten encyclopedia of wisdom that governed the peasant's life, a practical almanac of seasonal knowledge that connected them deeply to the world around them. Our final reflection is a restful journey through the peasant's deep, intuitive, and profound knowledge of the natural world. This was not a formal, scientific knowledge, but a practical wisdom, an almanac of the senses, written not in books, but in the landscape itself. It was an understanding built from a lifetime of observation, of living by the rhythms of the seasons, and of holding a continuous, intimate dialogue with the earth. The peasant's calendar was not one of numbered dates and months, but rather a great, flowing cycle of seasons and agricultural tasks. Time was measured by the work that needed to be done. There was plowing time, followed by planting time. There was lambing time in the spring, and haymaking time in the heat of summer. The year culminated in harvest time, and then settled into the long, quiet waiting time of winter. The seasons themselves were the ultimate clock, and the work of the land was the marking of its passage. The peasant could tell the time of year simply by observing the sun. They would stand at their cottage door in the early morning and know by the exact position of the sunrise against a familiar notch in a distant hill or a particular branch of an ancient tree that the sun had reached its lowest point at midwinter, or that it was now climbing higher in the sky, heralding the coming of spring. The sun was their compass, their calendar, and their ultimate source of hope. On a clear winter night, the sky was a breathtaking spectacle, a vast, dark canvas glittering with countless stars, unobscured by the lights of the modern world. The peasant knew the constellations, not by their classical names, but by more familiar ones. The constellation we call the Big Dipper, they knew as the plow. They would watch its slow, majestic pivot around the North Star through the course of the year. When the plow was in one part of the sky at nightfall, they knew it was time to sow the seeds. When it had moved to another position months later, they knew the harvest was approaching. The stars were the hands on a great cosmic clock, marking the deep, slow, and utterly reliable passage of the seasons. The moon, too, was a constant and influential companion. The peasant understood its phases intimately, from the thinnest sliver of the new moon to the bright, full face of the harvest moon. Many of their agricultural practices were timed according to these phases. It was a common belief a piece of ancient folk wisdom that root crops should be planted during the waning moon, as the energy of the earth was being drawn downwards, while leafy crops that grew above ground should be planted during the waxing moon as the energy was rising. This was a way of aligning their own small labors with the great, mysterious rhythms of the cosmos. This deep knowledge extended to the soil of their own fields. They knew their small strips of land with an incredible intimacy. They did not need a scientific analysis to tell them about the quality of the soil. They knew it by its feel, by its color, and by its smell. They would crumble the dark, rich earth between their fingers and know that this patch was fertile and well drained, while another patch, with its heavy, sticky clay, would be difficult to plow in the spring. This tactile, sensory knowledge allowed them to make the very best use of the land they had. They practiced an ingenious and sustainable system of farming, known as the three-field crop rotation. They understood that planting the same crop in the same field year after year would exhaust the soil. So they would divide their land into 3 parts. In one, they would plant wheat or rye. In the second, they would plant beans, peas, or barley, crops that they knew helped to put nourishment back into the soil. And the third field, they would leave fallow or empty, allowing it to rest and recover for a full year, while their animals grazed upon it and enriched it with their manure. It was a perfect, living cycle of giving, taking, and resting. The behavior of the birds and animals was a constant source of information, a kind of natural weather forecast. They knew that if the swallows were flying very low to the ground, it was a sign that rain was on its way. They believed that the thickness of a squirrel's coat or a sheep's fleece in the autumn could predict the severity of the coming winter. The natural world was constantly sending signals, and the peasant, through a lifetime of quiet observation, had learned how to read them. This vast store of knowledge included a deep understanding of herbal remedies for both their families and their livestock. The fields and hedgerows were their pharmacy. They knew which leaves, when crushed into a poultice, could soothe an ache, and which roots, when boiled into a tea, could ease a fever. This was a wisdom that was essential for maintaining the health and well-being of their small community. All of this knowledge, this entire, vast encyclopedia of the natural world, was not written down. It was a living, oral tradition, passed from parent to child, through practice, through observation, and through stories. It was a knowledge born of a profound and intimate connection to the land, the foundation of their entire existence. And here, under the quiet gaze of the stars, our journey through the secret winter of the medieval peasant comes to an end. We've walked the frozen fields, sat by the warm hearth, and felt the deep, steady rhythm of a life lived in harmony with the earth. We've learned that resilience is found not only in great acts, but in the patient spinning of a thread, the careful tending of a fire, and the quiet sharing of a story in the dark. Thank you so very much for joining us tonight at Sleeping Scribe. We hope this story has brought you peace, comfort, and a gentle passage into pleasant dreams. If you've enjoyed your time with us, we'd be so grateful if you'd consider liking, subscribing, or perhaps leaving a kind comment. It means the world to us and helps our small community grow. Until our next story, we wish you a deep and restful night. Sleep well.